Hello and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, a podcast about football finance, governance and politics with me, Adrian Goldberg, investigative journalist and West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder, and Charlie Methven. Charlie is one of the co-owners of Charlton Athletic, a former director of Sunderland, a one-time advisor to Tottenham Hotspur, and a boyhood Oxford United fan, and celebrating a 100% start to the season for the mighty Addicts at the Valley. Charlie, welcome. It's great to be back. This time we're going to be talking about the Premier League's PSR puzzle, or how to avoid the asterisks. Last season, Everton and Nottingham Forest both ended the season with points deductions for breaching profit and sustainability rules. This summer, there have been a few curious transfers that critics have said were designed to get around PSR restrictions. And the broad rule in the Premier League, we'll talk about the EFL as we go, Charlie, but the broad rule in the Premier League is you can lose £105 million over 3 seasons, which, as you have observed before, Charlie, doesn't sound particularly sustainable unless you're owned by an oil state, maybe.
Hello, Adrian, and I hope you've had a great summer.
Very good.
I know from our various messages that you have managed to get a couple of holidays, which I have not yet. It's often a misconception that football fans carry that at the end of the football season, everyone at the club goes on holiday for a couple of months, but that's only true of the footballers, really. For the rest of us, it's a very, very busy time of year. So I'm hoping to sneak a week just at sort of the end of August or beginning of September once all the infrastructure work's been completed and once the transfer window's sort of finished and all that type of stuff. But hopefully you've had a more restful summer.
Yeah, I went to Wales for a week and I had a week at the Edinburgh Fringe, which I would recommend to anybody who likes stand-up comedy and theatre and stuff like that. It is the World Cup of stand-up comedy. It's absolutely brilliant. And my team, the Baggies, have started the season okay. 4 points from 2 matches. We're out of the Carabao Cup, but from what I can tell, nobody seems to be particularly bothered about that. Your team are at the Carabao Cup as well, but I guess, like my team, your goal really is promotion this season.
Yeah, that's right. The goal is very sort of statedly promotion. And of all the competitions that a club of our type and probably of West Brom's type enters, the Carabao Cup is the least relevant financially. Um, and I say that with sadness, obviously, because my boyhood club Oxford, their finest hour was winning the League Cup. But these days, it's a bit of a pig in a poke because it's the only of the competitions that has no prize money, or at least not until you get to the semi-finals and finals. And as you probably know, the early rounds of that cup normally got very poor attendances as well. So really, the only way in which you can make any money out of it is if you progress pretty much to the quarterfinals and play one of the big boys either at home or even better away. Now, a couple of years ago, actually, Charlton did manage that and drew Man United at Old Trafford and made 700,000 or 800,000 quid out of that. But you've got to think that that's a relatively long shot. Once the big Premier League clubs start getting involved, you just sort of tiptoe and sneak your way through to that part of the competition. Whereas, of course, as we've explored before, in the EFL Trophy, which is the cup competition for League One and League Two teams, there's quite significant prize money. And in the FA Cup these days, well, the prize money's really got quite punchy in the FA Cup. And if you can make it through to the third or fourth round, then you'll be making a fair bit of dosh. But in the Carabao Cup, it's a lot of fixtures earlier in the season and no prize money and the cost of putting matches on with very little crowds to reward. So when we suffered a narrow defeat to your much beloved Birmingham City, Adrian, during the week, whilst of course one has disappointment in the moment of losing the game, when you wake up the following morning, you reflect that given that we're going to be playing an awful lot of matches this season, a sort of minimum of 55 and more like 60, that racking up an extra 2 or 3 in the Carabao Cup for no great reward probably wouldn't have been the best thing.
Indeed not. Now let's talk then about this world of PSR in the Premier League. Leicester City facing 2 possible points deductions in the Premier League. Sheffield United have dropped into the Championship and they've now been deducted 2 points for previous breaches in the EFL, or a previous breach in the EFL. So it's as though the Premier League and the EFL don't talk to each other for this purpose. They are separate, completely independent entities, which for me makes a mockery of trying to impose some kind of sensible financial rigor across professional football as a whole. But the big boys, this is where you can spend £35 million a season over 3 seasons, so £105 million in total. That's called profit and sustainability. As you've observed before, Charlie, it's neither profitable nor sustainable. Everton and Nottingham Forest both came a cropper under those rules last season, but at least managed to stay in the Premier League. And this summer, there have been some curious transfers that people have raised eyebrows at, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it's worth observing that we are in the dying days of profit and sustainability rules, and the pressure on those rules to come to an end is coming from two different directions, neither of which the Premier League or the Championship clubs can do anything about. One of which is from top down, from UEFA. UEFA have imposed rules which are similar to what we have in League One and League Two, where you can only spend a percentage of your revenues on your first team squad, including transfer fees. And they've set that limit at 70%, but it's being phased in gradually over the next year or two. So this year will be the first year when Premier League clubs who want to play in European competition will have to start thinking about, well, not even have to start thinking, we'll have to start complying with UEFA rules, which are being passed down from the top. And of course, the other side of it, which doubtless we'll talk about later and on another day, is the emergence of the football regulator, the football governance bill, which Labour has confirmed will go ahead this year after it was trashed by Rishi Sunak's bizarre calling it an early election. And so effectively, that's also going to mean, whilst it's not quite clear exactly how, it's going to mean more pressure on clubs to become more sustainable. So as I said, we're in the dying days of P&S, which, as you say, is set at 105 million in the Premier League, and at about a third of that in the Championship. Now, what is happening in the dying days of that system is that rather like Glaswegian pub goers in the moments before chucking out time, is that there's a sort of feeding frenzy to see just how unprofitable and unsustainable they can be and get away with before they're put under lock and key by UEFA and the football regulator. And various of the clubs are trying to swing the bat as hard as they can and then try and find what loopholes they can to try and get away with it. And the most recent loophole is trading players between each other, which was happening in the run-up to the end of the financial year. The football financial year is the end of June, and things get judged during that period. In other words, from July the 1st, 2023, to the end of June 2024, that's the period which clubs are going to be judged over. So in these circumstances, what you were finding in June 2024 was a sudden flurry of rather weird transfer activities where certain clubs who were, let's say, treading a very fine line when it came to the P&S rules started trading players between each other, and not necessarily players who you'd think of them trading or for amounts that you would naturally associate with those players. I hope I'm not being too skeptical here. And it all looked very strange. But to understand it, you have to understand the rules of P&S. So, in other words, let's just say, for instance, that Aston Villa decide to sell a player who you may or may not have heard of called Omari Kellyman to Chelsea for £19 million. And let's say that Chelsea decide to sell a player you might have heard of to Villa called Ian Matson for £37 million. Well, what's the advantage? Well, the advantage is that when you sell a player, the amount that you receive for that player, you can put straight on your books as revenue for that year. When you buy a player, you can amortize that transfer fee over the length of his contract. So if you're looking at a 4-year deal for Ian Matson at, let's say, around £40 million, the buying club can book that at £10 million a year over 4 years, but the selling club can put all 40 million of that straight on their balance sheet to help them balance out their P&S. And from what most of us in the industry can tell, we might be wrong, we might be being over cynical, but this seems to have been happening between a group of clubs who have been struggling to meet their P&S rules, trading players between each other, and basically exploiting this loophole of the amortization, the ability to amortize over the length of the contracts. That seems to have been what has happened. But as I said, it is very much the dying days of P&S.
Okay, but just so we're clear, there's nothing illegal about this. It's a method by which clubs can, if you like, stay within the rules, and it may be something which people would, as I say, raise an eyebrow at, but is legitimate. I mean, these players are moving, and the money is being transferred from one club to another, so there's nothing illegal about it. But it does mean then that if a club sells a player, the money coming in can immediately go to assist their profit and sustainability. But if you're buying the player, you can spread the hit to your profit and sustainability across the length of the contract, up to, as I understand it, 5 years. I know that Chelsea previously was signing players on 8-year contracts to try and amortize the value across a longer period of time. And UEFA clamped down on that because that was seen as a method of trying to circumvent the rules. But these things are within the rules, but eventually these rules will change anyway, and you'll be left with a 70% target. Then you'll only be able to spend 70% of your income on transfers and wages, and your income defined as money from TV, from broadcasting, from gate receipts.
Yeah. I mean, look, as you said, there's nothing illegal about this. And the other benefit to these clubs who are doing it is because as P&S is coming to an end, the downside of doing it this way isn't going to affect them either. Because effectively, what would have happened if P&S had continued is that whilst it might have helped them out this year, this is the acquiring club, let's say, it would have obviously hit them in the following years because it would have been amortized during those years. But effectively, what's happening here is that with the whole P&S thing coming to an end anyway, and with clubs being put under a totally different type of reporting, related to percentage of your revenues, it's not really going to apply anymore. So it's been a sort of free hit for clubs to do this, get the amortization rolling, and then say once the new 70% rules come in, say, well, look, we're on a different regime now. It doesn't really matter anymore. Of course, for people outside the football industry, it must seem absolutely bizarre that clubs are fighting so hard for the right to waste money. It's quite extraordinary. You know, it really is utterly bizarre. You've got governments, you've got supranational bodies like UEFA, you've got all sorts of people trying desperately to stop football clubs from wasting money, and yet football clubs, at least some of them, and I will note that they are not noticeably successful ones either, are simply desperate to waste more money.
And I suppose there will be an argument, and a lot of fans, I think, would support this argument, Charlie, which is that if some billionaire from the United States, if some oil state is willing to keep giving infusions of tens of millions of pounds to football clubs, ultimately it's their money that will be lost. It will make the Premier League continue to make the Premier League an attractive league for star players around the world. We have to remember the Premier League is in global competition now with people like Saudi Arabia, which is attracting top players to its league, as well as Spain and Germany and so on. So it's all part of the financial merry-go-round. And as long as there are rich owners willing to put this money in, where's the harm?
Well, I think that was an argument that was advanced, and maybe you're right, maybe it still is to a degree, but that argument has just been lost. So there are too many clubs who have gone bust, with whole cities being left in floods of tears, and politicians picking up the pieces of those administrations and bankruptcies. And people have just decided, and the Football League and the Premier League, they just had it. It's just we just don't. Why are we dealing with the outcome of all this? Because what these arguments don't get, is that when you build up an unsustainable cost structure, that cost structure is, rather like they used to say about, pet is not just for Christmas, pet is for life. A football cost structure is not just for 1 year. You're building a cost structure that lasts 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And when that owner becomes a sanctioned Russian oligarch, or when that owner becomes somebody whose business goes bust, or when that owner becomes somebody who, for various reasons, maybe even an early death, is no longer there to fund it, then the club is left with this enormous structure which it cannot afford, and then it goes bust, and the whole city floods of tears and psychological breakdowns. So it's just not an argument that's washed with anyone with any sense whatsoever. Every time I hear the argument, I sort of put two fingers in the mouth and start sort of making vomiting noises. It's an absolutely ridiculous argument to say that steroids should be applied routinely just because they can be. No, actually, funny enough, it's rather like that. Have you seen this new version of the Olympic Games where the competitors are allowed to take as many performance-enhancing drugs as they want? It's sort of a freak value, but it's not genuine sport, is it? I mean, it's it's a sort of competition in anything other than the sporting bit of it. It's just who can lay their hands on the most drugs, who can lay their hands on the most extraneous cash. Whereas in actual fact, in a sporting competition, in my view, the real competition here is about, well, who can be the cleverest, who can be the best at coaching, who can be the best at recruitment, who can be the smartest at squad building. These are all sporting challenges, and sport for me should be played on the field. And if you want to spend more money, which is of course we all do in a way, but there are legitimate long-term ways, sustainable ways to build that revenue, which can enable you to do that in the medium term. We shouldn't forget that Tottenham Hotspur are a highly competitive club these days. This was not the case 20 years ago. And that in terms of revenues, Tottenham were a mid-table side 20 years ago. Now they're a top six side. How? Why? Not because Daniel Levy and Joe Lewis have thrown mountains of cash at it. They've built the business. They've built their business to the point where they are now one of the big six. And during exactly the same 25, 30-year period, Everton haven't. And they've slipped back. So now Everton need to go on steroids because they haven't built their business. Tottenham don't need to go on steroids because they have built their business. So, as I said, those arguments have all been lost, and UEFA are now imposing this anyway. And these are the last gasps, the last twitches of the corpse of PNS, which we're seeing here. And it's all a bit pathetic and all a bit sort of silly, but it's just it's just what has to be gone through before we move to the new regime.
Sensible profit and sustainability rules would allow for stadium redevelopment, presumably not to be included within the figure. They would allow for academy development, for women's football development not to be included in the figure. I think particularly of Spurs, where you've got a fantastic new stadium, the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, which has allowed the club to bring in extra revenue. And it would be foolish, it seems to me, to penalise a club for seeking to expand its fan base, seeking to expand its potential sources of revenue.
Well, that's exactly right. And the new UEFA rules are exactly that, because they limit spending on your first team squad and your first team transfers, but they do not limit spending on any of the rest of this stuff, whereas PNS does, because PNS focuses on total profit and loss, whereas the new UEFA SCRs focus only on first team spending. So absolutely, under the new UEFA rules, you are encouraged to invest, genuinely invest. Fans think investing is going and splashing a bunch of cash on a new striker, but it's not. Investing is actually about building your own capacity to generate a new striker. It's about investing in your stadium so you can attract more fans and get them to spend more money, which then increase your revenues, enables you to do other things, etc. This is investment. This is genuine investment. The rest of it is speculative spending, which is a different thing, a totally different matter. Now, there are sort of transfer investments you can make. You can have a policy like Brentford have had of acquiring relatively cheap players from non-Premier Leagues in the belief that those players will end up being worth more down the track. And that, in a way, is a form of investment. But generally speaking, what Premier League clubs have been up to in paying vast transfer fees for prime age players, that's not investment. That's just spending spunking cash. But anyway, as I said, we're going to see some points deductions. We're going to see more, as Richard Masters, the EPL chief, said the other day. We've got to try and stop a situation where each league table has asterisks alongside it. I think we all agree with that. Well, I say we all agree with that. Certain Premier League bosses don't, but the rest of us basically agree with that. And I think that is going to become the case over the next 2 to 3 years, and we're just going through the last bit of the old madness.
Well, we shall see on that. Maybe a regulator will address the fact that there is this disjunction between the Premier League and the EFL, and within the EFL there is not consistency. It's one of the consequences of the creation of the Premier League in 1992 and the deliberate destruction of the old 92 club football league structure, that the Premier League has its set of rules, the EFL has its set of rules, and within that the Championship has a different set of rules to League One and League Two. That's crazy.
Well, that's all going to change anyway, and I'm just going to tell you how it's going to change. So the first change that's happening is UEFA's new rules coming in. That means that the 10 or so EPL clubs who either are in European competition or who aspire to European competition will have to comply with those rules, or else they won't be allowed to enter UEFA competition. They've then gone to the Premier League, those clubs, at the Premier League conference, and said, well, if we're going to have to subscribe to those rules, then the rest of the Premier League clubs should have to subscribe to the same rules. And they've negotiated a sort of compromise by which the ones who want to enter European competition have to stick to 70%, and the ones who aren't in European competition can keep to 85%, but it's still the same framework, it's still the same rules, just different levels. Then, if you look at the negotiations between the Premier League and the Football League before they were brought to an end, sort of around sort of autumn last year, a condition of the increased amount of money being passed down from the Premier League to the Football League was that the Championship also ascribes to these same bunch of rules at a percentage level yet to be determined. And there was some controversy about the idea that recently relegated teams might be able to spend a higher percentage than those who are established in the Championship. And then League One and League Two are already on those rules anyway. So effectively, what you will find within the next year or so is the whole of English football is on a percentage-based system, which is effectively known in English football as salary cap management protocol, SCMP, known in UEFA as squad cost control ratios, SCCRs. It's all the same thing, and it's just a much more rational way and a much more uniform, not even a much more, it is a uniform way of dealing with these things.
Okay, so I've got two questions about that. The 85% ratio that is allowed for clubs who are not expecting to compete in European competition in the Premier League is presumably to allow clubs like mine, West Brom, if they get promoted to the Premier League, to spend a little bit extra in order to try and compete with the clubs who are already there. And people can understand the rationale behind that. Of course, it does mean that if West Brom qualified for Europe by some fluke, that we'd then be banned from playing in Europe?
No, because your revenues would increase very significantly, quite quickly, just in terms of your guaranteed TV revenues and sponsorship revenues uplifts from being in Europe. And that would mean that the amount you were spending previously would doubtless, the 85 would convert to 70% of your new total turnover. So that's all being quite carefully thought through.
If you're actually in European competition. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So then you say, okay, the League One and League Two, they have these salary cap management protocols. Is that right? Salary management cap protocols, SMCPs. But my understanding, and this was one of the reasons why Bury FC went bust ultimately, is that they were allowed to spend more than I think it's 55% of their income in League Two on the basis that their owner at the time, not Steve Dale, who was in charge when they went bust, but Stuart Day, who was the previous owner, was willing to guarantee a greater spending than 55%. He said, I'm happily going to fund that. And the EFL said, yep, okay. you look to be a man of means, that's fine. Unfortunately, Stuart Day's student accommodation property empire started struggling and he couldn't meet those payments. But you have this weird situation that in League One and League Two, if directors are willing to fund additional spending from effectively from their own pocket, that seems to be allowed. That's classed as legitimate income by the EFL, but obviously means that clubs where owners, for whatever reason, can no longer continue to pay the income are in trouble. That's exactly what happened with Bury.
That is exactly correct. Now, in League Two, any extra additional equity funding, as it's described, has to be put in upfront in cash by the owners. So at least that puts some degree of short-term control and protection in place. In League One, that's not the case. Now, at the recent EFL conference, there was a lengthy discussion about this, and I and several others made the case for an end to this owner equity injection. And the case basically was, this is the same group of players. This is not, we're not recruiting from abroad. We're not able to bring in all sorts of different types of players. It's the same group. Almost all League One recruitment is the same group of League One journeymen being shuffled from one club to another club, broadly speaking. And I use journeyman in a sort of affectionate way to describe somebody who is a proper professional, who's got a proper professional career, but who is somewhere below the elite level of the game and above the non-league level of the game. So a proper professional footballer trying to earn his make his career, look after his family, etc., but probably not in the same plutocratic class as the Super Elite footballers. And you're also not facing competition for these footballers because in most cases, obviously, clubs abroad don't have any interest in signing them. So, the relatively small group of players who are League One footballers are either going to get paid £3,000 or £4,000 a week or £6,000 a week, entirely depending on what the market is doing. So effectively, once one or two owners decide, well, we're going to inject equity, then other clubs go, in that case, we're going to have to, otherwise we're going to get left behind. And all that happens is there's just an inflation of the wage market. So exactly the same players who were being paid £4,000 a week the year before get paid £6,000 a week the following year, and everyone just loses much more money. And that is basically what has been happening. The powers that be are trying to put together a sort of a limit on equity funding, which will be voted on by League One and League Two directors in September. We shall see what happens with that. Again, it's all a bit moot because what's going to happen in general terms, it's sort of like it's the last gasp of the old era, is that once the football regulator is up and running, and once the football regulator forces the Premier League to send more money to the Football League, one of the conditions of that will definitely be an end to owner equity injection. So it's, I'm saying to fellow club owners who don't seem to, in some cases, understand it very well, there's just no point in what you're doing, right? So there was a small club, the owner of a smallish club in League One came to me a couple of months ago and said, but if we need to be able to put money in order to be able to compete with you. And I said, well, with the best will in the world, the owners of Charlton Athletic are a lot richer than you. If you put more money in and we have to pay more in order to get the players that you think you're trying to get, then we will put that money in. That's what's going to happen. And then you'll end up paying more, you'll end up spending more and still not getting the players who we've taken instead of you because we're Charlton Athletic and we're a bigger club and that's the way it goes. And it's just this weird sort of knee-jerk psychological inability to understand how a restricted market can work and how the whole thing is. It's very, very difficult to explain because most of these people obviously have come from outside of football, don't really understand it. They just come in and their manager says, if we're going to compete this year, I need to be able to spend £6,000 a week on players. That means you're going to have to write an owner equity letter, equity injection letter. And that means when these people tell you that equity injection is not a good idea, they're just trying to squash you. They're trying to keep you down. They're trying to sort of restrict you in some way. So it was nothing of the sort. We're just trying to make sure that everyone can operate in a way which means that we all stay afloat and clubs aren't put at risk. So, it is what it is.
In the meantime, though, and until this ultimately washes through football, which I'm guessing might take 2 or 3 years at least to become the standard across the Premier League and the EFL. You have examples like Birmingham City, and I've got a lot of mates who are Birmingham City fans who, in a perverse way, are delighted that the club has dropped down to League One because they've got wealthy American backers. In the Championship, they're restricted to the losses of £39 million over 3 seasons. Their sense is that in League One, as long as the owners are willing to underwrite any debts that they might incur, they can spend what they like. And it's a far freer market for their owners. So they think they're going to do an Ipswich, that they can spend way in excess of any other club in League One and effectively build a squad not only to win League One this season, but also march then on through to the Premier League via the Championship.
The situation with Birmingham City is not quite so straightforward as that. Yes, their new owners are wealthy, but they've also, as you'll probably be aware, become tied up with Tom Brady, probably one of the 3 or 4 most prominent sports people in the world. And really the purpose of that is to drive commercial revenue. And their commercial income has been rising very, very steeply as a result of all this. So we're looking at a club which I believe this year would be expecting revenues of around about £25 million. Now, if you have revenues of £25 million, you can actually, I'm actually doing the mathematics here just to try and get it right, but if you've got £25 million of revenue and you're allowed to spend 60% of that on wages, that is a £15 million first team wage bill. Now, from what I understand, Birmingham City's first team wage bill is indeed £15 million. So I'm not sure that Birmingham is necessarily the best example of this right now. They are very aggressively raising their revenue. It's worth also looking at the fact that they've sold 20,000 season tickets. And that St Andrews is going to be full all season. They've also got all sorts of plans for the redevelopment of the whole area, which will come with all sorts of attenuated commercial revenues, no doubt. So I think Birmingham is slightly a strange case, but there are many, 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 many other cases where what you're saying would absolutely be seen as being true. And certainly there are clubs in League One this season which are going to lose a sum of money which would potentially be worrying were they at a higher level.
Interesting stuff, Charlie. Thank you. Perhaps just worth doffing our caps at this point to Ipswich Town, who, to my eyes, have done it the right way. They've built from the bottom up. They've had a terrific academy structure. They've had a good aspiring manager, and they're now in the Premier League. No, Charlie's looking at you saying no, not true, not true.
No, not really. They don't have a very good they don't have a very good academy. In truth, certainly nothing like West Brom's, and certainly nothing like Charlton's. And what they did actually, the first thing they did after new ownership came in was they sold their 2 best young players and used the money on a massive splurge on new players. Now, what they did do, and obviously every club should aspire to do this, was that they recruited really well. They recruited really well. They spent a lot of money by League One standards, a huge amount of money by League One standards. They were losing something like £10 million a year, £11 million a year, which is certainly not a normal thing to do in League One. But then I looked at their team that played against Liverpool yesterday, and something like 7 or 8 of the players who started against Liverpool were players who were recruited when they were in League One. Wow. And that is a remarkable feat of recruitment. The chief executive, Mark Ashton, who was the chief executive at Oxford as well, obviously my former club, is a very shrewd recruitment guy, and also very shrewd at the other people who he puts in around the club.
Charlie, great to speak to you as always. Thanks to Jed Thomas for his production efforts on this. Thanks to Mark Machado for handling the socials. We'll be back again next week. Thanks for listening. Cheers now. Ta-da.